if you have a mistake in a Torah scroll and you have to erase a word and it's not God's name, how do you erase it?
Well, it depends. I have a series of erasers that are okay to use because they're considered kosher or vegan or just neutral. You know, they don't contain any like non-kosher animals, for example.
Okay.
So that way it fits the halacha, right, the Jewish law component. But also you have to respect the materials. So you need to use like materials and techniques that are going to respect the materials that you're trying to fix and not cause any damage or not have any kind of like a long-term negative consequence.
Do you have one of those erasers here?
They're over there. But I do have a blade.
Okay.
Sometimes we'll just use a razor blade.
Okay.
It depends. I don't.
And that doesn't have to be silver plated, right?
Well, I do.
You
but
do, really?
I do,
Okay.
but a lot of scribes don't bother with that. So,
Okay.
and I'm not judging them.
Okay.
And then there's just your regular sort of X-Acto blade knife.
Okay.
So it depends. Sometimes you need to scratch it out.
Mm-hmm.
Other times it depends. Sometimes I will use. This is a bit of lava that I got when I was 12 in Hawaii on the beach, and you can see there's little bits of parchment caught in the holes of the lava.
So
That's actually what that is.
What do you do with the lava?
Oh, you scratch it out.
Okay.
You sort of grind it out. You can use glass.
Interesting.
Some scribes use glass.
Really?
Some actually are so skillful with these that they can literally like lift out. They can literally take like just a layer of skin off basically and lift it out without making too big of a hole. I never learned how to do that, and I'm too scared to, so I don't do it that way.
Wow.
Instead, what I do is I work from the top, and like I said, I might just use a series of different erasers. I have an erasing shield also
When
so
you
that I
say
can
eraser, you don't mean like on the back of a pencil, like rubber.
No, not like that.
What do you mean?
You can actually use a white plastic eraser because they
Really?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
And that'll remove ink?
It depends. That's why I usually start with a blade, or I start with something. I use oh, it's over there as well. Sorry, really, really fine sandpaper, like really super fine sandpaper. But you also have to know that the sandpaper is vegan because you don't want the adhesive that's in the paper, right, to not be kosher. I'm not saying that all scribes practice the same way as I do, but that's how I do it.
Wow.
And it's the same with if you need to do any gluing, like when you're patching a Torah or anything like that, and you have to use any adhesive, you have to make sure that it's not made out of non-kosher animals, because then you've pasuled the whole Torah again. You've made it unfit for ritual use.
Talk to me about the balance between, you said, so some people are upset when you take a 200-year, 300-year-old Torah scroll and you restore it.
Right.
Talk to me about that. Why would they be upset?
Well, so for some people, they feel like the moment that, because it's so old and let's say it's never been repaired, then everything about it is from that time and from that tradition and from that person, and that's all the materials manufacture, and it's all everything. And the moment I come to it, the moment I put one drop of my ink on it, the ink will have a little bit different recipe. It obviously is from modern times. If the ink has faded, if it fades to sort of like a dark gray or brown or something like that, it's fine. If it's turned red, then it's never been kosher to begin with. So
why was it never kosher to begin with?
Because it has to do, because you're only allowed to use certain, there are different recipes, but you're only allowed to use certain ingredients. But that's just one of the things that we're
What
taught.
ingredient would be there that would make it unkosher to begin with? Because
Well,
presumably it's red because of rust.
There's well, not necessarily, no. Like at least in my experience, when I've come across iron gall ink that has corroded, it's actually usually turned sort of like greenish black, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense.
And it's corroded and it's sort of like become quite crumbly. And then it's
And you mean actually greenish?
Um,
Because the greenish would indicate there's copper in there.
Sometimes it's
which we
greenish,
find.
sometimes it's bluish.
That's
But
also
the thing
copper.
is, so I have to make a caveat. That is, I have tetrachromatic vision, so I actually see like a million more colors than other people
really?
because I've
Okay.
got a different combination of like cones and rods and things like
I
that.
see.
So I'm not saying that if you looked at it, you could see it. I'm just saying this is what I'm seeing. So I'm seeing, and then when it comes away, like when it crumbles away and it's just the parchment left, you can see the kind of staining because it sits on top of the parchment. It doesn't soak in like with paper. It sits on top of the parchment, which is why you can, use a blade to take it off and not make a hole, for example. So yeah, you can you can see the sort of like the way the parchment's been stained.
Okay.
Usually it's sort of variations of like a beige or a brown or something like that, but even that can tell you sort of the ink content. But if you add things, it's like the curly pay as you, because we went there, but then we didn't finish going there. So I've fixed many Torahs where they were full of these beautiful letters from Sefer Tagin, which are supposed to, for you to go, I see this dot here, or I see this particular letter there, and that's supposed to remind me of the lesson of such and such, or that's supposed to be, you know, more information on how to behave or how to be a better person or that sort of thing. So there was a scribe that had gone through this particular Torah and several Sifrei, several Torahs that I fixed, where they went, oh, well, those aren't considered kosher anymore, or my tradition doesn't recognize those anymore, or never did.
So they removed the curly pays.
They didn't remove them. They just took a really thick quill and they just went, and they just like covered up with a bunch of ink. They just covered up the curl to make one really big, thick, ugly tongue inside the letter instead of a proportionate tongue, which would have been nicer. They didn't take the time to do that. So, so to me, that's a bit like you're destroying our older tradition, which I don't think you should do. This is just my personal opinion. But it's also a bit lazy. But that's good for me because by the time I got this Torah, like another 100 years later or whatever, his ink had started, and I was saying his because 100 years ago, it was very unlikely that a woman would have been fixing this Torah, but not impossible. And his ink had already started to fade because obviously he didn't have very good quality ink. So, so I could see the swirl. Did you restore
it as a swirl?
Yes, I did, and that took a long time. Well, the thing is, I gave that's part of like the estimate I gave to the synagogue that owned, you know, any of these Torahs, because like I said, I've seen it many times. I've said, okay, well, there's this. This is how I think about it, and this is why. But at the end of the day, it's your Torah scroll. So if I don't restore all of them, because they're not kosher either way, really. If it used to be kosher, we should leave it that way. But nowadays, they're not really considered kosher. But it would be really nice to bring back the tradition, I think, and so do several other scribes, male and female scribes. So, you know, so I leave it to them basically.
So you talked before about how there were these innumerable rules and they're getting more and more strict. And you mentioned Sefer Tagin. So now's a good segue into, you were going to give an example of that from the curly pays. So what are the strict rules that you think, okay, that's overkill?
Oh, sorry. What I meant was like when someone comes along later and they find something to do with Sefer Tagin and they don't accept it, so they write over it so that it's modern looking now, and they've destroyed the Sefer Tagin element. So a curly pay is one example. Another example is there's a couple of kufs, letter kuf. It's where we get the letter Q from eventually in English, because English actually comes from the same place that Hebrew and Arabic and Greek and everything comes from. Now what we see all the time is kuf has a space, right, between its the long descender, right, the long leg, and also its roof. So there's a space there. You have to write a space. There's two instances, it used to be, you know, according to Sefer Tagin, where you would actually have that leg, that descender, like touching the roof. And they were for specific reasons, deliberately, they were for specific reasons, and they were to reflect a particular idea. So a lot of Torahs I've come across, also some other scribe has gone, oh, that shouldn't be touching, scrape. But now that that's been done, I'm not really supposed to restore it. So that's why I don't like when... But like I said, I'm just speaking from me. I'm not talking about, I'm not saying what the rules are. This is where I'm coming from as a scribe.
Yeah, if it's any consolation, in the Middle Ages, they would restore Torah scrolls every couple hundred years, or I guess we don't really know how often. And when they would do that, they would often systematically go through and change the shapes of certain letters. Like I saw one Torah scroll where every single hay, the left leg was originally touching the roof. And every single instance, except a few where he missed, the restorer came and scraped away, which is chak tuchot. So you're not supposed to do that, but whatever. Who's counting? So it violates a certain obscure rule, which actually is in the Talmud, so it's not that obscure.
Not that obscure.
It's actually
makes it more universal that way.
right.
You know.
So, but apparently he figured it was better to do that than to
leave it as it is.
And he did it systematically throughout the scroll, except for a few places where he missed.
You could argue that it was already a letter hey, and then after he scraped, it was still a letter hey.
Well, he scraped it because I think he thought it was a chet, meaning, or he knew it wasn't a chet, but it would be misinterpreted as a
right.
chet.
So if he thought, oh, this person put a chet where there should be a hey, and he turned it into a hey from being a chet, then that is chok.
Fair enough. Okay.
But if he thought, oh, it's just one of these old-fashioned hays that we don't consider kosher anymore, because as you know, I mean, hay and chet used to look a lot more similar than they do now.
Yeah, I mean, they still can be confused today, but okay.
Yeah,
especially
exactly.
in printed on the old printed books in the 19th century.
Oh, terrible printing!
Sometimes they're in the printing is so imprecise that they're indistinguishable. Sometimes a hay and a chet.
Really hard, yeah.
Because the top does touch there.
It's true.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I feel your pain.